So we moved finally to the final session, and I hand over to Claire. The backbone of this, as you will find out, is some very interesting research which ODI have been undertaking, talking, including among many other more important people, myself, and asking some really pertinent and direct questions about what it is and what shape business's role in the new MDG should look like. So over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the plug. Let me just wave the paper in front of you. This is a paper on the private sector and post-2015 written by my colleague Paula, who many of you would have met earlier, where we're trying to just set out the scene, frame some of the questions that have been guiding our conversation today and that are going to be guiding the conversation in the future as we get closer to actually developing concrete goals and thinking about, more specifically, about the role of different types of institutions within them. Let me also thank our ODI's work on the private sector and post-2015 is funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, so let me also thank them very much for their support. And now I'm very aware that this session is, as you said, the one thing which is standing between yourselves and that much-needed glass of wine. So we're all going to have to be extremely entertaining. Let me first introduce all the panelists. We're going to ask them to speak, to just give some very short presentations based on their quite different institutional and company perspectives, and then we'll have to hand it over to you. Now, the last session, we were addressing some of the big questions, state versus market, power, questions around greenwashing and the kind of whole role of the corporate sector in development. That was a really important kind of prelude to the conversation that we want to have here, which is where we get really down to the practicalities. How is it that a post-2015 agenda can start to really provide indicators and incentives and targets for those companies like the ones on the panel today who want to address their development impact and think about how they can contribute positively to society, but also how can a post-2015 agenda draw in and incentivize those companies that aren't here, that aren't interested in this stuff and don't see it as their business. I think, obviously in this room, in a sense, we're preaching, we're talking here to a group of friends who all are in one way or another starting to think about these issues and care about these issues, but there's a much larger group out there of companies who are not thinking about this stuff. So I think the other thing that we need to be addressing all the time in this conversation is how do we do something that works for us and how do we do something that works for those people that are not here. Let me just start in no particular order from left to right. On my left, Dan Moberly, who is the Regional Head of Corporate Affairs for Africa at the Standard Chartered Bank. Then next to him, someone who I'm sure is very familiar to many of you in the room, Miguel Pestana, who's the Vice President of Global External Affairs at Unilever. Obviously, we were talking before about the corporate representation on the high-level panel. Unilever is indeed that company, for those who don't know, which is represented on the panel. Then next to me is Brendan Cox, who's the Director of Policy Advocacy and Campaigns at the Save the Children. On my right, Shinichi Ida, who is the Director of Global Issues at the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And finally, last but not least, Stephen Naidu, who is the Sustainable Research Manager at ESCOM in South Africa. So we have companies representing very different sectors, very different parts of the world, governments, and of course not forgetting NGOs and the role that they play. Let me please invite you all, let's just do it in that order. Just quickly give your thoughts about how we can really start to get down to some of the practicalities of this agenda. And then, as I say, we'll throw it open and people can draw in. Also useful to think about this session, but also some of the how what people are saying on the panel relates to some of the other issues that have been raised through the day. So, Dan, over to you.
Thanks very much. Well, now you've warned me that I'm standing between a room full of thirsty people and a glass of wine. I'm going to keep this pretty brief. And really just throw out 3 points that I hope will help us have a full discussion and debate here. One is around a reason to engage business in this debate that hasn't really been fully articulated yet today in what I've heard. which is around the kind of ability of sort of the businesses in this room to generate new networks, new information and new data that could be accessed to inform this debate. In Standard Chartered, obviously our business is across Asia, Africa and the Middle East, but in Africa alone, we have 7,500 staff who are almost entirely African nationals across the countries that we do business in. We have around 6,000 corporate clients, corporate commercial banking clients, and I think some of those 6,000 are the kind of voices that aren't necessarily being heard here today, but we want to be heard. Those are the local corporates, African corporates that are springing up across the continent. Some of them incredibly successful. Many of them at the moment confined only to their local geography, their local country, but some starting to go cross-border and even some starting to move out of Africa as well. And I think they're precisely the sort of people we want to hear from in these debates. So some of the businesses represented here today can actually generate those networks and make those introductions so those voices can be heard. We also have 870,000 individual customers in Africa. Now, some of those are people with a bank account, but many of them are SMEs, small businesses. And again, we want to understand the barriers to growth of SMEs. And the best way to do that is to obviously discuss it with them themselves and understand what's holding back their development and their growth. The last point is just around sort of expertise and history of some of these organizations. I mean, as a bank, we have been operating in Africa for over 150 years. And in many of the countries that we operate in, we were originally the central bank before there was a central bank. And we fulfilled some of the state sort of apparatus in the pre- and post-independence period and in countries like Nigeria or Kenya or Sierra Leone. So it does give us a kind of insight into the economic challenges facing these countries and perhaps a sort of a privileged insight into some of the problems that need to be addressed as we think through the next stage of the MDGs. The second point I'd make is just we need to be really careful how we frame this debate so we don't make too sharp a distinction between inclusive businesses and what presumably therefore are non-inclusive businesses. I don't think any developing country or country that has developed and industrialized tackled poverty or is trying to tackle poverty by stagnating. You do need some growth in here somewhere, and you can debate how that growth will be distributed, whether it's inclusive or not, but you're not going to get a sustainable tax base, you're not going to address issues around unemployment, you're not going to address many of the inclusion factors we want to talk about unless the economy as a whole is growing. And so the predominant role of the private sector in African countries, Asian countries, wherever else, is to generate that growth, and then we can have a debate about distributional impact. And so if you draw too sharp a line and say, well, we're not interested in businesses unless they're somehow inclusive and tackling the poor, you're missing out on all those businesses, including many of the African corporates I've talked about, who are generating the growth in these economies. And some of these economies are having a very impressive period of economic growth that we believe is perhaps more sustainable in previous eras. It's not just based on commodities. It's increasingly based on agriculture, infrastructure, consumption, and trade. So perhaps we need to think about, the whole spectrum rather than just inclusive businesses. And within that, think about, we want to focus on core business and how core business can contribute to development and growth. Obviously, if you're a bank, that's predominantly around access to finance. There's been an ocean of work written and debated and talked about access to finance. But many of the issues that we kind of know what the barriers for access to finance for companies, whether local corporates or SMEs are. We've got a lot of information around that. They are around the lack of reliable credit histories, particularly for smaller businesses. They're around the lack of a payments infrastructure in some of these countries. They're a lack of a sophisticated legal system that allows debt recovery, debt reinforcement. There's a lack of kind of harder infrastructure as well that's needed to provide credit to businesses. Now, businesses like Standard Chartered and others can help address some of those problems working with governments. We've helped the governments of Kenya or Nigeria think through how they might introduce credit bureau into their country so you get better information around borrowers. And that's really valuable, but many of the big issues that are holding us back, a business can't really do much about on its own. It needs the government, donor communities to come together to prioritize tackling those barriers, to do something about them. So we can provide insight and expertise around those issues. And are we comfortable with that approach where a business is effectively lobbying and saying we will be able to do more business and make more profits if you address these issues, but they will have a positive social impact. There will be access to finance resulting from that. I think we sometimes shy around that fact and try not to talk about it. The final point I'll just very briefly make is it was touched on in the last panel, and I thought it was a shame that it wasn't developed. I think John Fallon referred to it as the third rail, so I guess he didn't want to get electrocuted. But this issue of the role of the private sector in actually delivering some of the services that are what the MDGs are all about, particularly in things like health or education. And it was interesting, there was it was touched on and then everyone sort of drew back, and there's reference to privatization. That's clearly must be a terrible thing, and accountability, and business can't be accountable. But it started to make me think of some of our clients, business clients, SME clients in particular, across Africa, but particularly in West Africa. We're seeing the emergence of some really interesting low-cost private schools, and they're basically small businesses. And they're providing a quality of education that is hugely impressive and much desired by parents. And these are parents, they're not at the most destitute level because they have to pay school fees, but they're doing remarkable things to make sure they have the income to pay those school fees, and therefore the owners of those businesses providing that education are extremely accountable. But like a lot of SMEs, they face a huge range of barriers that prevents them from scaling up, prevents them from accessing more capital. And I wonder whether we can start thinking about more creative ways of bringing together governments, donors and business to allow those kind of small businesses to provide those high quality services that will help us reach the MDGs. So it could be donors paying those school fees. And I think there's a lot of resistance to that. These schools are often in urban areas rather than rural areas, so we want to look at rural education, so we don't necessarily support these schools. Or we might think, at the moment their pupil base, like I say, is not the extreme poor. But I also think some of it is, and we could address that by paying for some of the extreme poor to go to these schools. But I think part of it also perhaps is ideological. We're not comfortable in Western societies often with the concept of private companies providing what has traditionally been seen as the territory of the state around education and health. So we're clearly not comfortable about it in the developing world. And I think we should have an honest debate about that and say, are we prepared to support that kind of initiative?
Thank you very much. No shying away from controversy there. Here we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about where I think we are with the whole post-2015 process, and that isn't restricted necessarily to the high-level panel itself, but I will focus a bit on that. And I'd like to make a few remarks both about the process of where we are, and a little bit then I'll talk about what some of the key content issues and some of the actions that we need to undertake as business to contribute to that. And as been said, Unilever is, our CEO, Paul Pullman, has been invited to be a member of the higher level panel. The first meeting of the panel is actually taking place now as we speak. It's just finishing. And in fact, it's been a 2-hour session, so I'm not sure exactly how much of that will come out of that 2-hour meeting today. My prediction isn't a great amount. But we will have a fairly tough and rigorous agenda to follow up to the run-up of when the high-level panel report will actually be ready, which is in June of next year. So I have to start out by saying that we're going to actually only have 3 months in which to input to this report. So let's keep that in mind when we start talking about extensive consultations and the like, that we are actually operating within a very tight time frame. I think it's important to understand that this is a complex area. The UN processes, I've learnt, are by nature a complex beast. What we've got is a series of processes, some running in parallel and some running subsequently. The first, of course, is the high-level panel. In fact, we're probably going to be the first off the blocks, and we will have a report, as I said, which would be out there in at least June, but really discussed and presented at the next year's UN summit. So we're talking September 2013. But obviously, we've also got a member state-led process, which is discussing the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals, which again will be a parallel process led principally by member states, so separate and distinct from the UN panel itself. And you also have a process that's being coordinated with the support of the UNDP and the other UN agencies around a thematic deep dive now into 11 different thematic areas, which are feeding in a lot of the information and the thinking that will then contribute to the policy framework. And the panel. And I forgot to mention, of course, then there is the new and emerging Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is also looking through, with the work that Columbia and Jeff Sachs has now launched, to integrate academia as well as business and other networks into contributing ideas, but more critically solutions to some of the development agenda challenges. So we actually have quite a broad spectrum of partners to engage, and this process will roll over 2 years. So we're on a journey. The high-level report, as I said, is really for me the kickstart. It's not the end, and we have to understand that we are going to be embarking on a process that won't finish until the pen dries and the agreement is signed in 2015. So the second point I was going to say is about the voice of business. People were saying today, well, you know, there's only one CEO, or actually two if you include Betty, but there is, I think, a sense that, well, business is underrepresented or the voice of business should be heard. Well, Unilever obviously will be there as a business, we're there as an individual CEO, but the thing I want to say to all of you is that we are seeing ourselves very much as a vehicle for communicating the interests and the desires of business more broadly. So we're here to reach out to all of you. We are active members of many networks, and we see ourselves as really a funnel, a channel to enable us to put your voice and the voice of business into the panel. And we'll need your help to do that. As I mentioned, we have a very, very short window, and I think the first thing I would say about the role of the panel is that it's really the opportunity to put some big ideas on the table. It's the time where we can actually have not just talking a little bit about what business does, but what business thinks or has a vision of what it will do and what it can do. So we need to give a vision for the future, not just talk about what we do today. It's really about vision setting. That's what I think the panel is looking to do. So we need big ideas. And it won't be enough just to talk about what businesses' current practices are, although we will, of course, have to do that, because I think there is still 3 jobs to be done. There's still a question of relevance in this debate on development, because there isn't, I feel, in many member states, and indeed, even I would argue within the panel itself, there will be a question about, well, what is the relevance of business? And you have to keep coming back to reiterating what that relevance is. And we actually need that because it's the key to then unlocking a lot of what then flows from that. The second piece of it is we do need to talk about a narrative, the business case. We do need to talk about what that business case looks like. For us at Unilever, this is all about actually equitable and sustainable growth. That's what we think the business narrative is all about. So everything that we're talking about ultimately is interlinked into every aspect of our business. It isn't a standalone. It is not about corporate responsibility. It is about business and business performance and business growth. And the third piece of it is this vision and what would the future look like and what can the future drive. I think this engagement with a wider network of business beyond big companies and how we can integrate and network down into countries, I think is really critical, particularly if we're going to get the credibility with the G77 countries and some of the developing countries about the benefits and the role of the private sector. When we were looking at all of this, I try to explain to my CEO in a very simple way what's really the issues on the table. And in fact, I come back to there are 4 interlocking and interconnected areas of focus that we have to talk about. On the first side, there is a big, obvious focus on the current MDGs and the delivery of what we've already set out to deliver but haven't yet done. So it's the MDG plus debate around poverty and poverty alleviation, essentially. There is now a big focus on equity, and that brings in, for me, other dimensions like human rights integration. It brings in gender issues. It brings a range of issues which were not captured in the original MDG debates. We then have a third area, which is really about the role of growth, economic growth, and the framework conditions that need to support growth. That's all of the agendas around things like corruption and anti-corruption and all those issues which are business-relevant issues. And the fourth big area is actually the question of sustainability, and in particular with the focus on environmental sustainability and the debates we were having about where the natural capital issues are in and transparency issues within that are being reflected. Those are, in my view, the sort of broad thrust big buckets. Now, some people might call out fragile states and the role of and where fragile states fit in that, because you know there's a big specific focus on fragile states. For me, they fit in the sort of broader inclusiveness and equity area. But those are the broad sort of areas of attention. But they're all interlinked. That's, I think, the critical point. You can no longer talk about growth without understanding the interlinkages with impacts on resource scarcity and resource scarcity challenges and water challenges, equity issues and gender issues, issues around the links between growth and poverty reduction and so on. We just can't split these things apart. And if we try, then we're failing. So it's all about how we deal with the interconnectedness of this. And I think that the thing that we're looking for me, if you were asking me what are the things that we would want to get out of the MDG process, I think what we would favour is keeping it focused, simple, not long checklists. I think we have to have something which is measurable, and I think we have to have a process ultimately which has to be something which we regularly hold people accountable for. And then it will actually have teeth. And that's something that we have to sort of build in to any of the thinking that we as business input to this process. And I'll just end on a couple of things. I think that, I think it's really important to underscore what business does do, because business brings so much to, we are investment. We talked about the role of FDI today. We are the big drivers of foreign direct investment and inward investment, far more than ODA. We are the providers of technology platforms and the enablers of that. We are capacity building. We are providing education. We're skilling our workforce. We're providing an enormous amount that we can do to skill and train. We are creating jobs. We are playing a role in procurement. We are driving partnerships. So business actually is woven through every aspect of this process. And that's something we should really underscore at every opportunity. But what we also then need to do is talk about, well, what do we need to do more of this, and what do we need to do this better? And for me, that's where we do have to come up against the issues that we are confronted with and be challenging of that, and be challenging of governments and other stakeholders to help us to address those issues. Because we can't make progress without the other partners playing their role. And for me, that is about things like, the trade environment, the issues of anti-corruption. It is about legal frameworks, things like land rights. Pretty critical. If you're going to build sustainable agricultural supply chains, you have to have land rights embedded in member states, and in many cases they're not there. So I'll finish now with two comments I'd like to make at the very end. I think we need to think differently about engagement. The first thing is, we don't, as business, I think we should start thinking about engaging with civil society, not in silos. I think it would be great actually to have, as we have colleagues here from Save the Children, to start to think about joint discussions and joint dialogue, and not just trying to do this from a business perspective. And secondly, I think we should exploit the opportunities of social media, because we have an opportunity to use social media channels actually to solicit views and inputs. And I know that's actually something that the UNDP themselves have built into their processes, and we should think about how we can exploit them as well. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, just to start, I think I am traditionally rather sceptical about civil society telling business what business should be doing in a business environment, in the same way that I'd be relatively sceptical about business leaders telling civil society what they should be doing in a civil society environment. However, I think things are moving and things are changing quite rapidly, and the type of partnerships which are becoming more and more common are already beginning to break down some of those barriers and some of those silos, although we obviously still have a long way to go. So we Save the Children, for example, are working very closely at the moment with GSK on innovation within the nutrition sector, looking at specific products that might have a reach to the bottom billion in a way that would be quite transformative to some of their work at the moment. We're working with Unilever on similar areas. So I do think those barriers are beginning to break down, and I think that's very healthy. I think that what's also very healthy is I think what's come out of today in terms of that very clear sense that the debate we're having about this is very much beyond philanthropy. So philanthropy is clearly a base, and if anybody wants to give the Save the Children money following this, we're very happy to accept it. But that's not the core of the narrative. It's not the core of the framework that we're talking about here. From Save the Children's point of view, we think the way that we should use the 2015 framework is both to get an agreement, but also to change some of the debates that we've been having about development and that have been rumbling on for a very long time. In the business sector, we think the opportunity is to build on what is already there. So there's a lot of debates, it feels to us, around some of the what business does in quite specific areas. So whether that's on nutrition or on education or on healthcare, which are all critical, and we have to do more of that and find out ways of leveraging that contribution further. But I think just as important, and an area that we haven't discussed as much, is at the more strategic level how business engages in communities, in countries, in questions about growth and governance. And I think one of the reasons, I think two reasons for why that's important. One, I think that the nature of that conversation is potentially much more transformative. And two, I think it's at a level that will engage not just the CSR departments and not just the external affairs departments, although the external affairs departments are very important, but also the CEOs, the people who are deciding on the future vision and direction of the organisation. Some companies have already done that, and I think there's others that can learn from some of that. The way that we've been thinking about it, again at Save the Children, is similar to the UN Compact, so the spheres sort of ladder, if you like, of engagement, with at the core of that, the sort of base of that sphere being around core business. So the basic things that companies do, whether that's around respecting human rights, paying taxes, creating employment, their procurement, and then building from that into bigger and bigger and more external attempts at impact, everything from adapting products, specific product lines, so they have more impact on society, changing core business so that it's more inclusive or more sustainable, and then building from that, again, advocating externally for change. Now, there are some companies, and a lot of them in this room, who have already stepped up many of these stages in that ladder, but I think the question that many of you would have a much better sense of than us is that where we should situate the debate? Is, in a post-2015 framework, should we be situating on those companies who are at the upper tiers of that ladder, or are we trying to get everybody on that first rung? I think from our point of view, that first rung is so important, whether that's around paying tax, whether that's around adhering to and upholding and advocating for national standards, whether that's around your own procurement standards, whether it's around your own carbon output. We think those elements are so crucial to the role of business, that if we get that right and have a bit more focus on that, probably less glamorous, but could have much more impact. I think the second thing I'd say is around process. And I think it's very unlikely, beyond a few indicators, that we'll have specific agreements coming out of this process which are specific to business. I think what they're much more likely to be is around broader goals, objectives, targets, and we think that is right. We think that's what they should be. And then when it comes to implementation, the question is, what can a whole series of different actors, from governments to private sector to civil society, what is it that they can do? And I think the really interesting question here is there, coming out of this framework, when we get this framework, assuming we do, and the politics won't be easy to get us there, but assuming we come out of 2015 with a framework, what does the accountability mechanism underneath that look like? How will that be led in business, and who will sign up to it? So could we build something which really does get everybody to that first stage of that ladder? How do we incentivize that? And how do we disincentivize and make it very difficult for companies who are trying to stay out of that basic standard? And then the second element to that is then how do we make that as attractive a springboard to the likes of Unilever and GSK and others who are doing much bigger and bolder things? So that's, I think, for us, the opportunity in this post-2015 debate, both to start to change the nature of the debate and engage more people, but also to try and make sure we've got the minimum and using that minimum as a springboard for more.
Thank you very much. Right, I'm longing to come back on some of this, but I'm going to hold off until we've heard from all of the speakers. So let me now ask Shinichi.
Thank you, Claire. I'll be very short, but I was asked to make a presentation only a week ago, and frankly speaking, I used to be a diplomat assigned to the Japanese mission to the UN, and I know a lot about the United Nations, but frankly speaking, business is not my forte. I'm very good at drafting GA resolutions. I'm very good at communicating with G77. Don't underestimate it. My American friends were not necessarily good at it. But anyway, what I'm saying here is that in the United Nations, the dynamism is very different from from the one that you see in this room. One of the previous speakers mentioned a very complex process leading up to the post-2015 development framework. It is complex, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to New York diplomatic process. The draft declaration and the draft goals will be negotiated amongst the New York ambassadors, who are not necessarily knowledgeable about development, let alone business. So what I'm trying to make a point here is that every time we might want to discuss a post-MDG post-2015 development agenda, we have to bear in mind what kind of dynamism is there and what kind of language they are using in coming up to the final product, the outcome out of the entire process that you are now working. That is very important. Otherwise, for example, somebody just mentioned that the time changes quite fast, or things change quite rapidly. That is not the case in the community over there. I can assure you. Every time I talked about business, for example, when I was there, one of the typical responses that I got back then was, "Are you trying to justify your reduction of your ODA?" The North-South dichotomy, or the tension that you have seen for the longest time, is still there. So in that community, discussing business in the development context is sensitive. So you have to be very careful in the language that you use in the process leading up to the final outcome. That is, I can't emphasize enough about it. Having said that, though, and precisely for that reason, one of the speakers mentioned that the panel that actually started the discussion this very afternoon is very important for their task in setting its visions, because it will be ideal task for the panel of that nature to discuss macroscopic view, if you will, how the businesses should be involved in development activities, what is the synergy between the government's funding and the private sector funding, without being politicized. The proper tone setting can be done by the body like the high-level panel. I think this is the topic we're discussing in this room is very, very good, can be a very good input to the high-level panel. Before getting into that diplomatic process that you see in New York. It's very, very important. Let's set the proper tone on this extremely important item before intergovernmental negotiations start. I want to make a plea, because I can say I was deeply involved in 2005 UN reform summit process. That was what was envisaged. What was envisaged at first was very different from the outcome that you're actually seeing today. I'm sorry, every time I start talking about this, I can't stop myself. Anyway, I don't want to, but still, because I prepared.
You can keep on if you like. Don't feel extra.
Because I made a short presentation paper. Let me just quickly go through with it. But as I said, the business is all these something that is very familiar to you. Involving the private sectors can be problematic, but at the same time, it's very effective. That is something already you know. I just picked up some interesting examples of cooperation cases between Japanese companies and development entities. For example, excuse me. This Takeda pharmaceutical company, the Japanese pharmaceutical company, actually made a lot of contribution to the global fund, and it's actually doing a very good business. But Ajinomoto, it's a Japanese food company, on the other hand, has nothing to do. It's doing business in Africa, but it is not relying on international organizations at all. And Daiichi Sankyo is working with NGO on the ground. So funding directly goes to the people who are benefited from it, but at the same time, they are using it. For the implementation, they are using a local NGO. I mean, Sumitomo is a very famous case that it's a net. The Sumitomo Chemical Company person is over there. If you have questions, please ask them, not me. So what I'm saying here that if you pick, my point is here. I promised I won't be long. So what you are saying here is that let's avoid the generalization. But having said that, though, if you pick up the specific cases, successful cases, if you will, and closely analyze them, you can draw some bit of a conclusion that can be helpful to anybody else. That is policy mix. The public funding in cooperation with the proper international organizations, and also either in implementation or the funding mechanism, and also the effective energy on the ground that can achieve results. That could also be the case from what I call a cyclical approach. Japanese government started the project by the ODA, public funding. It was taken over by Takeda Pharmaceutical Company. It was also assisted by the Hino Motor, the automobile company. And also, and this is the more analytical framework, action plan to check. And actually, this case is JICA, the Japanese Development Agency, did planning, and pharmaceutical the private companies did the implementation. Checking was done by the academy, and action was also. But anyway, action was also. They were done by the corporation. But what I'm saying is that either in implementation or the planning or actual cooperation, you can come up with a good policy mix of the good, if you want to make a change in the field. So the point I wanted to make at first is that why don't you let's avoid overgeneralization, but at the same time, if you can come up with a good policy mix, you can make a change on the ground. That is the point I wanted to make. I prepared for a week. But my bigger point, after I have listened to all these people who are very, very knowledgeable about the issues, if you can come up with a good policy mix, you can make a change on the ground. But in order to come up with put that kind of proper element in the post-2015 development agenda, you really have to avoid the politicization in the UN community. That is very, very important. That was actually, I just came up with them only a minute ago. I didn't want to make a presentation out of it, but after having heard what you have just said, I think it was more proper to emphasize that point rather than the policy mix part. Thank you.
My colleague started off with a confession. I've going to start off with two confessions. Firstly, not only am I not a business person, even worse, I'm a biologist. So that's bad.
We need some scientists on.
Secondly, the organization that I work for, ESCOM, is not a private company. It's a state-owned company. It operates on a private company model, but it's actually a state-owned company. The reason I mention these two facts is that when I joined ESCOM 18 years ago as an environmentalist, we really drew the short end of the stick, because within the organization we were hated as environmentalists because our activities and our work slowed down the engineers' projects. Our environmental impacts resulted in 3-year delays on build projects. So we were hated within the organization. External to the organization, we were viewed as ogres for working for a company that had 95% of its supply burnt on fossil fuel. So it was a lose-lose situation all the way. But since then, I've seen the organization evolve to A, start appreciating the benefits of looking at the environment, and B, start looking at issues broader than the environment. Now, there's one very fundamental reason that I mentioned this, and it's a perception of mine. You may be able to correct it. But certainly in a lot of businesses out there, when you mention the word sustainable development, your engineer's face, typically his eyes glaze over. And he says, no, that's for the environmental people to sort out. That's their issue. Not realizing the full depth and magnitude of the scope of sustainable development with all the 3 dimensions. I'm not sure if others in the business sector have come across that phenomenon, but it's certainly something in the engineering field. So that's the one point I want to make. But very closely linked to that, if you look at which country department takes responsibility for sustainable development within the United Nations or wherever, you'll see very often it's the environmental or the environmental and related fields. And that's something that we may need to start speaking about or engaging in debate. But that's just by way of introduction. In Eskom's, I'm not sure if any of you know Eskom. Eskom is an electricity supply organization. We've got about 40,000 megawatts on the South African national grid. As I said, about 95% of that is coal generated. In April 2008, Eskom came to one of its darkest periods in its history. We had insufficient supply on the grid. We had insufficient supply in our power stations. And as a result, we had to go to rolling blackouts in South Africa. A very, very dramatic situation. We were hated, is putting it mildly. We were really detested in the country. We were causing all sorts of economic mayhem. There was billions being lost in non-productive hours. You'd go to a dinner party and your favorite friend would like cage up on you and say, "What the hell are you Eskom guys doing?" There were cartoons in the newspaper, Eskom, the Prince of Darkness. It was a bad time. But I think it really brought home to South African society at large the integral part that energy plays in our daily social lives, in our daily lives, and how we take energy for granted in so many ways. The important role that energy plays in all three of the dimensions of sustainability cannot be understated. And that's just the one point I wanted to emphasize to you. More recently, we're very involved in our new build program. We're building really massive plant. It's a 5,400 megawatt power plants. These are really big plants. And with it comes a lot of consequences. We are creating entire towns, urban towns, construction villages around close by to these power plants. And with that, there's a whole lot of concomitant consequences. Issues like alcohol abuse, drug abuse, prostitution, migrant workers, social problems that we really never took cognizance when we did such plant in the past. But now it's come to us that we are responsible in our business activities for these repercussions. And it's something that we need to take home and start managing. So I think it's come home to us in a very dramatic sense that we need to look beyond just our economic or financial performance. We certainly need to look beyond our environmental performance, but we need to look holistically at the triage of social, environmental, and economic performance. And what our performance does for the economic situation of our country and the region. Just remember, in the southern end of Africa, we play a very important regional role as well in aiding our neighbors. We were fairly fortunate in terms of having leadership with, who were fairly forward-looking. We became members of the United Nations Global Compact, I think, in about 2000. And we found a very comfortable formula of being able to report on those items that were beyond, at that stage, our economic annual report back. And we were able to report back on issues which we had not engaged with previously. Issues like human development, behavior, ethics, corruption, gender empowerment, etc. And we've become more entrenched into the Global Compact more recently, becoming a part of the LEAD program and the blueprint. And we find that it makes a very logical framework to go to the next step of detailed GRI reporting and, in fact, possibly leading up to Sustainable Development Goals reporting. So that's the type of framework that we're looking for the next logical step. We've got reporting mechanisms in place within the organization to be able to report on these issues. More importantly, we've got buy-in from the people within the organization to start realizing that these factors are significant to our future. And how we report on them and how we continuously improve and how we manage them is an important into Eskom's future. Finally, just to close off, we're finding that in rolling out the Global Compact to other partners in South Africa and in the region, we're finding that more and more as we speak and engage with these partners, we can quite easily convince them that it makes good business sense to start reporting on these factors in a very transparent and a very open manner. So I'd like to end there. Thank you, Madam Facilitator.
I'm wondering if companies are properly structured to take on projects like these. People have mentioned having the time, pushing out far enough for full implementation and start to see results coming in. You think about pressure coming back from, at least thinking from a US perspective, the time frame is pretty short. You know, people want quarterly results, particularly shareholders. So when consumer interests butt up against boardroom or shareholder interests, you know, where's the give? You know, does there need to be some restructuring of companies or rethinking at the top in order to make room for longer term projects?
That reminds me, when people speak, could you please introduce yourself? It's all right. You can ask another question, introduce yourself then.
Yeah. My name is Pierre Vanot. I'm from the Swiss mission, working for the Swiss government. 20 years of experience in bilateral, multilateral development support. And basically, to the question, is there a gap? Just simply say, we were all happily disinvesting in anything related to agriculture, production, or anything with our support. And then in 2008, food crisis came, financial crisis came. This is the answer to the gap. And I think we all did our best. We were really hoping that it's time to, as somebody said, for instance, with development activities to grow the business because we don't need it. But suddenly realizing that there is still quite a lot to be done. We're having clear ecological crisis as well. So the point is very simple, and what we would expect in support in our discussion, in the governmental discussion that has clearly mentioned have certain very specific rules. It's a delicate business, but definitely we need very strong input from the private sector, from the corporate sector, being looking forward in the next 15 years. There is no solution, of course, but simply participate, but consider the complexity of the sustainability agenda much beyond than the one. It's basically a call for support in order to give the right, the appropriate input for them when we go into the governmental discussion.
Thank you, David.
Hi, is this on? Yeah. David Stephen from the Centre on International Cooperation at New York University. Sorry, Ben and I were just talking about jobs, and it seems to me that the most important thing the business can do is create jobs for many, many young people, in particular who don't have them. Is there anything that a post-2015 framework can do that will make business likely to create more decent jobs than it would otherwise do without a framework at all?
Thanks. And in this last question in this round at the front here.
Well, I'm Susanne Stormer. I'm with Novo Nordisk. So one thing that I'm struggling with is actually, and thank you, Mr. Ikal, for reminding us of the complexity of the post-2015 process. But if we then add to it the new process that will be about global sustainable development goals, how do we then juggle those two? So I guess that my question to the panel is, how can we fold those two processes into one that is manageable and still has that bold vision that Miguel was mentioning to us? So I think that really, I think is our big challenge ahead, not just the one.
SDGs. Oh.
Thank you. So we have questions about the sort of internal trade-offs between consumer interest, shareholder interest within companies. We have questions about the kind of big global issues like food crisis and the role of different institutions in that. Very specific to the point question about, is there something a post-2015 agenda can do to help companies create more jobs, and the broader issue, which is obviously broader than simply the private sector engagement question about how these very difficult and controversial issues can be turned into one set of goals. Please don't feel you have to, somebody has to address each question, but you don't all have to address every question. So please just say the things that you feel most relevant on this.
I'll just come in on 2 points, if that's okay. I mean, one was around, your original question, is there a gap, which was echoed somewhere, is there actually a point to engaging the private sector? And I won't repeat everything I said around the kind of collective wisdom that the private sector can bring to this, but I think it's important when we think about partnership. Two of the things that you find quite frustrating if you're sitting in a corporate is often civil societies will come to partner with you, but actually they're asking for funding for something that they've already decided to do. And that's a conversation you have all the time. And I know because I used to work in civil society organisations before I worked in corporates and committed that sin. And similarly, when you're partnering up with governments, too often it can be, here's a new policy prescription that we would like you to endorse, and you're not engaged in the design of that. And I think part of this process is to use the MDG discussion almost as a sort of forcing mechanism to consider ways that business, what is the expertise business has that can be put to use. So it may not be about designing a new framework with lots of explicit targets or requests on business to hit, but more just kind of how business expertise can be brought in. I think the MDGs have been a brilliant way of addressing development issues and thinking about development for a long time, but they were set up in a very statist way, inevitably to address problems that have historically been the territory of the state. And so the next thing is just to move beyond that and bring that insight in. The question on jobs is a really interesting one, and I think this process does need to consider employment growth. The challenge here is that for business, jobs are a cost, not a benefit. And you hear a lot of people talking, particularly in contexts where I work in Africa, around kind of jobless growth. In other contexts and other periods of history, we've called that productivity growth, and it's generally what's kind of driven over a long period of time quality of life improvements. So we need to be we can't kind of create jobs for jobs' sake. But where we should focus, and if we are going to talk about employment in the context of the post-2015 MDGs, is going to be around both the local corporates and the SMEs and their growth, which can generate jobs in turn. And that's why I said in my initial presentation, let's not just focus on sort of bottom billion debates, although those are critically important, because the best will in the world, whether it's multinationals, local corporates, or even the SME sector in African countries, we're not going to generate kind of vast amounts of job just by focusing on that sector. And we need to look at more kind of higher up the income scale and businesses that are operating in that area, and that will lead to job creation. And that's it's quite a politically difficult thing to say, that we're not necessarily going to immediately focus on the absolute poorest sections of society that are excluded from the business debate. We're going to look at, because you then start perhaps being accused of kind of trickle-down economics. So it's a difficult one, but I think that's a sector to go in. And we actually do know there's a lot of literature and a lot of understanding of what the barriers to the growth of those companies is in terms of their access to capital, access to skills, technology transfer, etc., that we can address, but we need this grown-up debate around those issues through the MDG process.
Well, I can hardly say that I'm not supportive of the process because I'm right in the middle of it. So I agree. I think that the reality of this is that MDGs were really looking at a bottom billion, and we were really talking about how do we get to that bottom billion. The conversation I think we're having, and is really about what I think we're talking about, is the total planetary boundaries. It's about everything. And therefore you can't opt out of it, because business is absolutely critical to how this will evolve. And you can't split out a debate, and that's exactly what I was trying to say earlier. You cannot split out and focus on poverty issues without understanding the economic imperatives and the growth and the economic growth drivers that are critical to helping you to get there. Then you have to understand what kind of growth and the limits to that growth and what the issues are going to be, and that's where some of these other elements kick in. So we are in a different world. We are dealing with a different paradigm. Business is talking and has to talk and understand that it is dealing with that complex world. My CEO always talks about a VUCA world, a kind of volatile, uncertain and complex world. And that's the world we're in. And therefore every business has to operate within the confines of that. And therefore every business has a stake in what the framework looks like. And actually what we see this as is a roadmap. It's setting out what are the things that we're going to actually all collectively, and that's the critical point, have a stake in working together to solve, because we're all impacted by it. And we have to understand that poverty impacts business, because it means consumers can't buy the things we produce, it means that we have an unhealthy workforce, it means a number of other things. It creates fragile states, which don't allow us to go and operate within a country. So actually we have a big stake in this, both direct and an indirect stake. I think the second point about the jobs question, of course you see that will be the emphasis. The emphasis will be, well, business is there to create jobs. But actually, if you listen to what it is, it's what kind of jobs and under what conditions, and what are the things that apply to them, what are the things which have a bearing around the job creation debate that we're having. Talking about business, you talked about a business voice. Is it one voice or is it not? No, of course it's not one voice. But then civil society isn't one voice. And I see a lot of people from civil society who stand up and say they represent 5 million people. And I have no idea whether they represent 5 million people. They say they do. And they go...
I represent a billion.
Oh, of course you do. And I sell to 2 billion consumers, so that makes me a consumer activist. I think that the reality is that we've got to kind of just accept that it's always difficult to get one single voice, but I think we have a duty to try and seek to collectively put forward a business case. And there will be differences. There will be issues between companies operating in the north versus the south, small versus big. But what we are about is actually talking about what the vision is ultimately going to be that everybody should try to move towards and address and progress towards. Even if they're at a baseline, ultimately what we're saying is we want to move towards this. And we have to do it, because if you listen to my CEO and look at what we're already experiencing in our company, and I know it's probably true of many others, we're already seeing the impacts of what is actually happening to the planet at the moment. We're faced with rising commodity costs. We are dealing with water shortages today in our business. It's happening to us right now. These are real things. We do see big swings, up and swings. We have unrest in many countries around the world in which we've operated. So this is not something that we disconnect from our business strategy. It's about how we build a sustainable business model. That's what I think all companies are about. So that's why I would say we have a stake in the game.
The kind of world of company decision-making diverges from the world that virtually she was talking about of politics, because clearly within the operations of any company or any individual they're very much integrated, but as we all know, not just in New York but within different capitals as well, the worlds of development and the worlds of environment are very divorced from each other. Different ministries, different UN agencies, different people involved in the two conversations. So it's these sort of two very different realities colliding, which is what makes it very interesting, but also slightly alarming, as you were implying. Brenda, and your 1 million.
So I entirely agree. I think the point I was going to say it myself, that I think business is exactly as homogeneous as civil society is. And I think we heard at the beginning, actually, from Standard Chartered and from Unilever, a very different account about the types of growth that we were talking about, with a colleague from Standard Chartered talking about equity and sustainability issues being secondary issues, and it being very much at the heart of what Unilever were talking about. So it does feel that there are very different approaches and very different, and we should recognise that and we should talk about that and not pretend that those differences don't exist. Well, one of the things, and this is slightly a question back to Unilever, is given the leadership that your company and some others are taking in this area, it is one of the purposes of getting these goals agreed, trying to get to the stage where you're not going to be undercut by other companies doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and therefore undermining your ability to be profitable, while at the same time address some of the resource constraints and some of the other issues that you're facing. Because it feels to me that the leadership that Paul Polman and others are showing in this agenda is admirable, but it also feels like it's a risk if other companies don't follow suit. So I'd be fascinated to understand whether you see the goals as addressing that ability for other companies to come in and undercut on issues like standards or human rights or other issues, the more progressive position that companies like Unilever taking. The other thing I'd just say, which has come out of this debate, is that we need to be really careful about not overloading this process. We're coming up with a post-2015 framework which is not going to solve all of the ills of the world. We know that now, and if we're trying to come up with a framework which does that, we can all go home. So we need to be really specific about what are the incentives that we're changing, what is the gap. So I would say, from a Save the Children point of view, it's all about children now, from a Save the Children point of view, that actually the incentive that is lacking is a focus on that bottom billion. And the way that we need to address that absolutely has to be cognizant of sustainability. It needs to be cognizant of the interaction between the bottom billion and wealth creators. So it's not just about saying give lots of money to the world's poorest, but we do need to be clear what is at the heart of this vision, because if we try and do everything through this framework, I don't think we'll achieve anything.
That's okay. Thank you. That's such an interesting point. I'm tempted to ask Miguel to answer that question very quickly.
The question he asked about.
Is this all a part of the business?
Part of our cunning plan.
I think it's a good cunning plan if it is.
A cunning plan by Unilever. No, to be honest, I think look, the reality is that we as a business kind of recognize that there are huge, massive changes happening, dramatic shifts which we have to work around and work within. And the ability to impact or address those, we can only do so much of. And it isn't about undercutting competitors or forcing other people to do what we think is right. It's an understanding that actually these issues, whether we like them or not, are going to be part, that, you know, we are reaching a tipping point if you look at it from where we see it. If you look at where the climate change issues are going, 2020 is the tipping point. So we're not that far away from it. So we have to kind of we have to work around and work with managing our way through this issue. I don't think it is about a competitive differentiation right now, although I'd like to think that companies that do this will benefit from it, not just in terms of that you know, if they get it right, they get their cost structures right, and they can build a long-term sustainable business plan around it. And I think we could, if we do it smartly, gain some consumer benefit. If we're a consumer-facing company like mine, if we do that right and do it smartly. But actually, it is about recognizing that if we have, as much as we want to do to address water issues in our value chain, we can do so much, but we need lots of other people to understand that there is something that needs to be done to address water scarcity. We buy agricultural commodities. 70% of all the agricultural commodities, 70% of all the water we use is in agricultural production. When we're a buyer, we can control water when we're a grower, but when we're a buyer, we have to understand that that is going to be a massive, massive barrier in the future to the cost of our supply chain if we end up with some of the really significant climatic shifts starting to impact commodity pricing. So we have a stake in the game in putting water on the agenda and getting governments and civil society and other groups to start thinking about what those issues mean and how they need to address them. So it's self-interested, yes. It may create competitive advantage, yes. But ultimately, actually, I think there is a sort of bigger picture here, big macro benefit to what we're advocating.
Thank you. Let me give you two chances to come in.
Just quickly. There was some discussions about growth and jobs. It's extremely important point. There's no question about it. There's no reference to growth and jobs in the current MDGs. And so I think I don't want to use the word gap because it's very difficult to define the concept of gap in this concept. But having said that, though, I think it is the right approach to try to add an aspect of growth and jobs to the post-2015 development agenda. However, if you really want to talk about growth and employment, you really have to get yourself involved in serious discussions about macro. If you really want to talk about growth and jobs, you can't avoid discussions about fiscal space. You can't avoid discussions about the external balance. You might have to really have to discuss structural reform of certain economies. So at the end of the day, if you seriously pursue that path, what will be the difference between the Washington consensus of the MDG, Washington consensus and MDG discussions? I'm exaggerating a little bit, of course. I'm playing as a devil's advocate. But still, there's always a danger why MDG was so appealing to us. Because we were sick and tired of the Washington consensus. And the year, as far as the Asian part of the world is concerned, the year 2000 was 2 years after the financial crisis in Asia. That was particular reason why the MDGs were so appealing to us. We never considered MDGs as a sole guiding principle of our aid policy. It was appealing because it was focused on the poverty eradication. So in discussing, in contemplating the post-2015 framework, I think we shouldn't lose the beauty of the current MDGs from that perspective. Just small but important point.
Thank you.
There was a question about is there a gap, or I took that to be a need for the SDGs. And I think very simplistically, the answer is yes. If we want to aim for national sustainable development, we need all of the oars pulling in the right direction. And we need all of the players in a country, whether they be NGOs, governments, businesses, to be working together in partnership rather than antagonistically trying to do one another down. Is there a business point of view? I think business is one of the few beasts in the country that deal with this complex situation jointly. You find that in governments it's aggregated down to different departments to look at that aspect, and so governments look at it from a silo sort of perspective and eventually come together in some sort of intergovernmental committee where egos, never mind. But so I think business is an entity that deals with it on a daily basis jointly.
George is getting hoarse. Microphone took it.
Are companies structured to take up something like this? I think from a functional point of view, companies certainly, I know in South Africa in reporting on corporate governance and King 3, from a reporting and functional point of view, we've been performing in this manner. Whether we take the podium and start fighting this fight is something that we have to go back to organizations and debate. But I think the point was well made. Do we have the luxury and time to start debating on the outcomes, or is it something that's going to be foisted upon business and has to be factored into costs, which you and I will pay? How do we fold these two processes into one, and what are the politics I'm not going to try and address. But the one about create jobs, create more decent jobs, I think is a very, very important one, and it's actually a two-edged sword for business. On the one hand, everybody knows South Africa's history, where we're coming from, the dramatic gap between the very rich and the very poor. It's something that we're battling with as a company, so as a country. So what we've done is we've entrenched redress regulation into our constitutions. Very uncomfortable things, very difficult to deal with, things like black economic empowerment, black women-owned industries. But it's something that we have to do as a country to start leveling out our playing fields. Very, very recently, as an organization, we've started dealing with, we call it SLGs, subcontractor localization programs, SLPs, where all of the businesses that we're doing, we're focusing on where we can get technology transfer from the OEMs, the Hitachis, etc., transferred into the country and transferred into the company so that we have localization. I don't know if anybody remembered about a month and a half ago, we had a fairly dramatic situation in South Africa where 34 people were killed in a mining strike. And that for me is the other edge of the sword. If businesses are acting in unethical or unfair labor practices, that needs to come to the fore. And that for me is the beauty of something like SDGs, is that it levels out the playing field so that there is no unfair labor practices. It treats a human being with dignity. And that for me is, yeah. Thank you.
Although one would argue one doesn't need SDGs to make it illegal to shoot people who are on strike. We have those laws already.
No. This was to do with the way the people were being recompensated.
Okay.
And the SDG would obviously speak to that.
Okay. I think this jobs question is absolutely fascinating. I mean, I think we come back again and again to jobs in these, not just in the private sector debates, but generally in debates on post-2015. I mean, as the very interesting research that Ben Leo from One at the back there has done recently on opinion polling shows, again and again, when you ask people the thing that they most want in terms of the thing which for them is the biggest barrier to ending their own poverty, it's not having a stable job. And that's the thing that they most want. And again, in these intergovernmental conversations about post-2015, you come back to the desire for a new framework to have more to say about growth in jobs. But I also completely agree with the point that, if one really takes that to logical conclusion, what you're talking about is the kind of macro policies that I'm not really sure belong in a post-2015 agreement. They're really much more about national governments making their own policies and absolutely having to have the, what in the jargon on trade we used to call policy space to do that. You can't make kind of blanket global agreements, rules, targets, whatever shape it turns out to be, about what makes a good macro policy to create jobs. So I think we're kind of stuck here in a very interesting way in this conversation between wanting to do something, and there's quite a strong consensus about wanting to do something, but not really being sure that we have the appropriate tools to do it in the process within which we're having that conversation. I think it's absolutely fascinating. The other thing I think just came back to me from this exchange on the sustainability thing, it strikes me that to some extent perhaps governments and companies are pulling in slightly different directions here. The received wisdom on this sort of issue around trying to marry development agenda and a sustainability agenda is that for governments it's much easier actually to tackle a development agenda. It's a bit of a win-win. It's giving people more stuff, things that they want. Whereas a sustainability agenda is much harder. It's really about trying to live within boundaries, potentially talking about rationing things, putting prices up, all kinds of things which are politically unpopular. But it strikes me that to some extent the incentives might be working in a different direction here. That for some companies, sure, poverty is a kind of opportunity cost in the sense that you have a group of people who are not consuming or not working or whatever, but they're not an actual cost, they're just an opportunity cost. Whereas, sustainability issues, rising prices, land insecurity and so on is an actual cost. And perhaps the urgency there is much greater. And I'm quite struck in this conversation by, it's a pure hypothesis on my part, that the incentives might be slightly different here in terms of trying to bring these two agendas together, as I'm hearing again and again this week, we all have to do, and it all has to be one set of goals. Sorry, I'm slightly abusing my position as chair there. Do we have another quick round of questions? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, everyone's really, really come alive now. I can see 4 hands sort of all in that middle cluster there. So let's start with those and see if we've got any more before we wrap up.
Good afternoon, Frank Williams, World Vision International. I'm just wondering, a few kilometers down the street, Standard & Poor's and Moody's spend a lot of time kind of grading companies in terms of their health, if you will, their financial health. And it strikes me that there's somewhat an opportunity here to enter into a dialogue, the business world, with, if you will, the social sector, the NGO, the bilaterals and multilaterals, to say, we're going to help create sort of an MDG scorecard for us. Now, we don't know what that looks like right now, and we know there's complexity to that, but sort of imagine 8 years from now that every company with their audited financials, they have a page that says something about this, and it's third-party, validation versus the way, with all the ambiguity, any company, any NGO can self-validate. So I just wanted to get a reaction to that.
Hi, Louise Stan, United Nations Population Fund. I just wanted to ask a question about the framework, to pick on something I think Dan said. Is there a possibility that the framework can create business for private sector? I think it was something you said about education in Africa and private companies offering education. and therefore taking the burden off the state for providing that. And I'm coming from a health perspective in the UN, and maybe contrary to what you've discussed, but having a financial handout isn't necessarily what we would like. You know, for me, well, my personal opinion is what I would like is for private companies to offer cheap, widespread, low-cost private healthcare or health insurance schemes, so that the new middle classes, say in Africa and Asia especially, can have access to this and reduce the burden on the state and for what the UN and others can provide. So really, I was wondering if this sort of, within the framework, we could incentivize private sector a little more to think of this as a business option. Thank you.
Interesting. Right, I've seen, was that Ben at the back? Okay, one more here and then Ben at the back.
Thomas Christensen. I worked with the Office of Partnerships at the UN, but until recently was with the government of Denmark. And I've also been in the role of negotiator and very much sympathize with my Japanese colleague. And I think the line you were onto, the MDG, SDG differences, are actually also something that's felt deeply by many countries at the UN. There are the developing countries that feel strongly about the MDGs as their agenda, and to see the broadening of the agenda to SDGs that are global as in a way taking away from development and being part of the agenda that he alerted to, namely getting away from ODA commitments and getting away from the pro-poor, pro-development side of it. So I think that has to be taken into account when you define this. It may be rational in bringing the two agendas together, but it might politically actually make it more difficult for us. And just to add a third layer, which none of you have addressed, but there's also the 2-degree target of the climate negotiations that is coming into play. And I think Miguel sort of hinted at it with the tipping point part. But I guess my question to you as a panel is more, if you were to design the perfect way of interaction between the UN and the private sector in achieving MDGs, SDGs, what have you, how would you do that so that you would have a focus on the barriers that you're talking about, Dan, the tipping points, and in creating the best market solutions? Because, and that's maybe well end, you're right, it's macroeconomic to talk about growth and jobs, but the reason why we get to no result in the climate negotiations, and the reason why Rio almost failed and had to have a result imposed by the host government, is because it is so difficult. And because for many governments, growth and sustainability, growth and lowering emissions and having a more sustainable use of the natural resources don't go together. And unless we solve that riddle globally, as a global community, those negotiations will be stuck. And we won't advance the agenda, whatever the panel will say.
Thank you. At the back here, please. Yeah.
Hi, Ben Leo from the One campaign. I've actually found this absolutely fascinating and very enlightening. I want to follow up on a couple of the responses to some of the previous questions that came, particularly the ones about jobs and equitable, sustainable growth. One of the things that I think is really interesting about the private sector and the post-2015 development framework process that's underway now, and the high-level panel as well, is the opportunity for the private sector, along with other outside groups, CSOs and things like that, to not necessarily only join an existing discussion, but actually help shape the existing discussion. And in that way, going back to the employment and growth agenda, that's clearly something that is on the minds of private sector entities throughout the world. And it seems like there would be some synergies. I'm not saying the entire post-2015 framework should be dominated by this at all, but it seems like there should be some synergies where companies can bring views in a very kind of big way of where there's overlap between individuals' priorities, government's priorities, et cetera. So the gentleman from ESCOM, I think, highlighted at least one that's in my mind, which is around energy poverty or energy issues, a critical barrier to businesses in Africa. You see that in business enterprise surveys across the continent. You see it pop out in household surveys. It's going to be a big factor on jobs. That's just one of probably a half a dozen issues. Access to finance is another one that pops out in all kinds of surveys. So the question is, after a very long introduction, is how much opportunity do you think there is to actually bring that voice in an aggressive way, in a constructive way, to not only join the debate, but also help shape it in a constructive way that provides a lot of value and guidance in terms of what should come next?
Just a quick response to the how can industry solve the problem. Industry is the hub where innovation happens, where new ideas can not just be made or be had, but they can be developed, they can be applied, tested, implemented, and commercialized. And with that entire process comes the whole process of job creation, of new products onto the market, of manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. So industry has got a very important role to play in that area. So I think that's one of the areas where industry can solve the problem. The whole issue about not just join, but help shape the discussion. This is going to sound very, very wacky, but it's going to take a bit of a soul change in humanity. Governments are going to have to step back and say, okay, we cannot just carry on like this in an us, them, or NGOs and that triangle of the different opposing parties. We're going to have to partner. And we've seen that with the Sustainable Energy for All. We are going to have to partner with the least most obvious partners that we have thought about previously, to start working together, to defining roles, to clarify what our individual roles will be. And in doing so, we have to submerge self, whether it be self as an individual, self as a team, self as a company, self as a country, and start working for the common good. I know that sounds quite soppy, but I honestly believe that's what it's going to take.
Thank you. That's a nice note.
Just a quick response to some of the questions. I'm sorry I didn't take notes because I was so exhausted. Just quickly, the first question, will the post-2015 framework create business opportunities for the private companies? I'm paraphrasing. And also the question from my colleague from Denmark, what would you do to create the partnership or cooperation between the private sector and the United Nations? All these questions reminded me of what I did in 2005 in the context of UN reform. At that time, one of the main issues was the One UN, now currently called the Delivery as One. And actually the intra-UN reform was not really, it was difficult, but it was not the most difficult one. The more difficult part was the harmonization of the Bretton Woods institutions, because Bretton Woods institutions basically looked down upon the UN. I'm exaggerating a little bit, of course, once again. But there's a complex feeling between the two. There's no question about it. So back then, we kept telling ourselves that let's not think New York, let's think fields. That was the logo we kept using back then. The meaning is that if you consider whatever the issue it might be from the perspective of the New York politics, you most likely end up nowhere. But if you seriously consider a certain issue, whatever it might be, from the perspective of the situation on the ground, you can come up with a good solution. You might be able to come up with a good solution. So it just occurred to me that motto that I use, so that I bore in mind all the time, was maybe helpful in contemplating the issues we are discussing in this room as well. Because what is a cooperation or the partnership between the UN and the private sector? Probably not on the headquarters level, but in the field. Probably there must be endless opportunities or possibility that we can pursue successfully or effectively pursue between the UN country teams and people working for the private sector in Africa or in Asia, whatever the field it might be. So rather than thinking what kind of framework we might be able to come up with as opposed to 2015, development agenda in an abstract way, probably we might be able to come up with something more effective and helpful by accumulating or collecting good episodes that you can see, that you can find in the fields, that is on the ground, not in New York. So just a small footnote to think about. Let's not think New York, let's think fields.
Which possibly brings us back to the conversation that we were having this morning about specific examples of things which are working now.
So just to come back on three things very quickly. The first, the question of, and there's a theme running through. The first, the question of private sector sort of demand creation, whether these goals could change demand for private sector services in areas such as health or education. No, I think would be my short answer. In that, I think to our colleague from Japan's observation, getting these things negotiated is something we all have to be cognizant of. Coming up with a framework which suggests X country either privatizes or nationalizes its health system, I think is probably an unlikely one to get under the radar. Secondly, on the jobs question, I think there is, I'm less negative on that. I think there is a way that it can be at the heart of this framework without necessarily getting into all those macro questions. If we look at what this current framework has done, it set ambitious goals and targets. What it hasn't done, and what it was very clear not to do, was to set the specific policies that you needed in order to get there. Now, this time round, I think there will be more interest in specific policies, but that doesn't have to be the case in every area. It is national governments who will set the legislative framework, the fiscal framework at the national level. And so I do think we could have a bold goal around reduction in unemployment rates or increase in employment rates without necessarily then, at this level, us trying to legislate for how every government does that. And the final point I want to come back on, and I don't have a particularly clear answer on, was on the point that was made about how we change reporting and corporate accountability around these MDGs. I think I would be slightly concerned about doing that in a very narrow way, where at the end of every annual report there was the list of targets with what the company had done against those. But looking at that in the broader way, in some of the conversations that we reflected on earlier, in terms of what's the corporate strategy, the sort of the how strategy for its core business, and making sure that its core business meets minimum standards, whether that's labour standards or tax standards, I think would be transformative. I don't know how we do that, but for me it does have to be something which, a slight difference of emphasis, I think, between ourselves and Unilever. We worry more about people undercutting those leaders in the sector. We do worry about those companies who are still not at this meeting, or those companies who are not at that standard. So I do think looking and thinking really hard about what are the accountability mechanisms that we have, which are more than what we currently have, which is congratulating and thanking those at the top of the tree. How we do that, I think, is a key question that we should wrestle with.
Thank you.
Okay. Firstly, the question on the role of the private sector in demand, I think it's actually important. The example you were quoting, we're talking about education and health. Actually, you will see that the majority of health and educational provision in Africa is already coming from the private sector. So it's not necessarily, this go back to the early comment I made at my opening remarks. It's about the proof points. We already have lots of evidence to demonstrate what the role of the private sector actually is. And in fact, they do replace state provision in many instances already. Do I think it will lead to more demand? It all depends on what the driver that then leads from that is, because if it creates the right incentive mechanisms, which are going to be driven by member states, it's not going to be driven at this level. And I think, for me, the whole point of what I think the MDGs are about is they create an enabling environment, an enabling framework. It's the member states that have to go and then define how they're going to implement those. And we shouldn't think about, that's what I was trying to say, I think this thing should be kept simple, relatively short and fairly focused, with some targets against it, which we think we can come back and measure, but critically find a mechanism to measure so that we can get the countries to come back and remain accountable, which has been one of the success factors of the current MDG framework. but keep it simple, not get into this really prescriptive kind of detailed layers that need to go underneath that, because I think that is going to be the death knell. And it will make it impossible to get adoption. The things about jobs, I agree with everything actually that Brendan's just said. I think and I think everything in fact the rest of my panel colleagues have said, so I won't really go into that and belabor the point any more than to say that I do think that there are things that are conditional elements of the kind of job creation that we would like to see that may feature in a framework under the MDGs.
What sort of thing? Sorry.
So you talked about, well, because, for example, you know, let's be absolutely candid. Right now, core labour standards, if you say core labour standards, there is an ILO process, and we know that actually the ILO process is geared towards member states, it's not geared towards individual companies, but we have one of the big challenges many companies like mine have is that there's massive variance between what it is that individual countries implement or don't implement and how they implement it. So it actually makes it very difficult to sometimes manage your way through that complexity. And often we're then asked by people like yourselves and others, why aren't you doing this? And it's partly because the legal framework is different. So I think that's one example. And I think the other piece on accountability, I think we keep talking about corporate accountability, but I still come back to the fact that what we're trying to build here is an overarching framework of accountability, which brings in other stakeholders. And governments are a critical player, because there, for me, what they will do is create the enabling environment. So what we're doing within the MDG framework is putting things on the agenda, which then enable you to have the conversations, which right now don't happen. So I would like to see nutrition and food security on the agenda of the MDGs, because I think there's a huge, huge challenge that we're facing around food and nutrition. It's not there, so as was pointed out earlier, governments stopped talking about it, stopped being a relevant form of dialogue, and therefore we underinvested in it, and we had 20 years of underinvestment, and we're paying the price for it. So it sets the agenda. It doesn't solve the problem, and that's the thing we have to separate. It's not about solving problems. It can create the frameworks for the processes then to happen at country level that will help solve the problem.
The issue of reporting and standards and ratings. A lot of companies are very reluctant to criticize ratings agencies because they're rated by them. I mean, we've always hated them and said they're rubbish. And I think the financial crisis has proven us right. But the reason why is they used to come to us all the time and say, you're in these terribly risky markets like Nigeria or China. You know, what you need is a nice, safe American banking business, and they would downrate us. So I wouldn't take those guys as your sort of models for how to scrutinize corporate behavior. They're not very good. What I would say is, you know, should we be looking to report more against the MDGs? I think companies just churn out so much reporting now. And yes, maybe you could look to standardize it or maybe kind of drill down into what's useful. I'm not sure getting down to the level of specificity of the MDGs and reporting against those is enough. I think it's better and more interesting to look at what companies say they will and won't do. And you know, we're very clear and very public about the kinds of business we won't finance, as well as the things that we will do and what standards we apply, where we're operating to global standards, whether they're voluntary or compulsory, but also where we go beyond those. And to go back to Brendan's concerns around, you know, trade-offs and undercutting, that's not something we're particularly worried about, because I think in some sectors, and it'll vary very much from company to company, it depends on the kind of business you're doing. We're quite happy to be undercut by competitor banks who are prepared to finance things that we think would massively damage our brand or would ruin our relationship with the government or the local authority in that locale. So we just don't want to do that kind of business. And we're also not in the business of just kind of collecting as many clients as we can. So again, we're quite happy to eject clients who we believe don't meet certain standards because they're just not good business. And the one thing you find in most of the areas where we operate, whether it's across Asia or Africa, is there's so much opportunity. The challenge for us is deciding what business to do, because we are actually starting to see the growth now, and we have to choose between it. The challenge is that we're, like all business capital, constrained, and it's quite hard often to raise capital to do business in these places. Investors won't necessarily yet put in capital into businesses operating in these countries as much as we would like. So I don't think the trade-off thing is necessarily that big a problem for some businesses. And I also think if you try to kind of encourage all business to operate to the same standard, you might end up baking in inadvertently protectionism, because, you know, banks in Mozambique, say, or Angola, local players, are not going to be able to operate to the same standard we do. And we shouldn't at this stage in their development expect them to. I think they would then just simply not be able to operate, and you'd only end up with international banks operating in those markets if you discourage them from perhaps operating to a slightly lower standard. Just a final point on service delivery. I mean, obviously, based on what I said right at the start, I agree that we need to be mobilizing the resources of the private sector in delivering health and education. I think the MDGs, one of their great power is a way of mobilizing resources for development. And I guess in this, I just hope that through the sort of thinking about the next set, if we're going to have very ambitious MDGs beyond 2015, I think we're going to need to mobilize the resources of the private sector to deliver them. As Miguel said already, a lot of the activity in health and education is being delivered by the private sector, and we need to look at what the barriers to doing more of that more efficiently and to a higher quality. So I think we don't have any choice other than to kind of look at them to provide service delivery. And I just hope that kind of some of the concerns that people have about the nature of the private sector or its accountability don't block that. I think that would be a shame.
Thank you very much. Well, for me, the indicator of a good meeting is one that ends on time, and I'm very pleased to say that we have hit that exactly. So may I thank you. Can we all thank the panel, please, very much.